What's up everyone, it's JG here, ruining your favorite games with math and graphs. Today I want to talk about Vanguards. Vanguards occupy kind of a weird spot in the meta. They don't hit as hard as guards or casters, and they don't tank as well as guards or defenders. They make up for this by being cheap and generating DP. There are three types of Vanguards that are worth using. Type 1 are operators that generate DP so fast that you can field better operators before you need them to do very much. Type 2 are Vanguards who are tough enough to hold lanes for a while until you can deploy some support for them. And Type 3 are Vanguards who are just straight up good at what they do, that you would use them even if they cost more and didn't generate DP. Agents and Standard Bearers are usually Type 1. Pioneers, Tacticians, and the new Strategist archetype are usually Type 2. And Chargers are terrible. Type 3 is Ines, Mulesys, and probably Silver Altar. For Type 1 Vanguards, DP generation is central to their value proposition. For Type 2 Vanguards, it's a critical perk. There are more considerations for team building than just DP, but you may find yourself occasionally needing as much DP as you can possibly spare, and wondering which ops are best for the job. Well, I did the math so you don't have to. These numbers assume all skills at Mastery 3 and make reasonable assumptions about operator potential and modules. If you're a nerd like me, the full methodology details are in the video description. Also, if you're watching this in the future, be aware that Silver Ash Altar is not on the global server yet and is excluded from the calculations. Now, I can compute a detailed DP over time curve for everybody, but it's a pretty meaningless number without some sort of context. So instead, we'll mostly compare everybody to a well-known barometer, Myrtle. I've got 4 different measurable outcomes that reflect different ways a Vanguard can be strong. Number 1, the break-even test. On a map that starts with 0 DP, how long does it take before you have more DP with the operator than if you had never deployed them? Number 2, on a 0 DP map, how much DP can they produce in 30 seconds beyond their own cost? Number 3, the backup test. Tons of good operators cost between about 18 and 22 DP. How long does it take for the operator to produce that much excess DP? That's the point at which they make the difference in bringing a whole extra operator to the field. And number 4, in a long map, like an Annihilation mission, what's their long-term DP return? I've scored this at the 3-minute mark. These give us measurements of DP generation at several different timescales, any of which might have some strategic value. Note that all of these are sensitive to the operator's own DP cost. For them to be useful, they need to produce a return, recovering their own cost and then producing more. Myrtle herself is pretty strong across all of these, and since she's easily accessible to anyone, she sets a good bar to measure from. She breaks even in 22 seconds from a cold start, and produces an excess of 6 DP in 30 seconds. She hits plus 20 DP by 47 seconds, and produces 76 DP in 3 minutes. First, let's talk break-even time. The Syracusan sensation, Texas, is the queen here. She's excellent for an early DP sprint. With her talent and Y module, she's the first to deploy, and recoups her cost 10 seconds after deploy. Total, she's profitable 6 seconds faster than Myrtle, and Myrtle doesn't outpace her until Myrtle's second skill cycle at 48 seconds. And of course, Texas has block 2 that whole time, which makes her an extremely defensible choice for a first deployment. Agents are also all over the top of this list, but with an asterisk. They score DP per attack, but if they have unlimited targets available, almost every agent with almost every skill can beat Myrtle to break even. Cantabile and Surfer are at the top of the list with their S1s, which are expressly designed for a quick sprint like this. They can almost tie Texas if they keep making attacks. Matsukiri is also worth a call out. If you count his DP reduction as DP, he beats Myrtle by 1 second. Whether you should count that or not depends a lot on who you want to deploy next. Agents also dominate in 30-second output, though with all the same caveats. Myrtle is only A rank here because she can be so outperformed by the others. Cantabile and Surfer on their S1 can produce 2.3x what Myrtle does over this time, or up to 3x if you just retreat them when their skill ends. That's plus 18 DP in a 30-second sprint. If you don't have targets that work for them, your best bet is another Standard Bearer like Myrtle. All the 5 and 6-star Standard Bearers have the same S1, which is a simple upgrade of Myrtle's skill. Although they break even slightly slower, they pass her by the 30-second mark and are up 33%. The 5-star agents S2s are worth about 1.5 Myrtles under ideal conditions. Honorable mention here to Texas, who ties Myrtle at 30 seconds without any of the finicky requirements of agents. Inez can also tie Myrtle and has a far superior overall kit compared with the other agents. The overall winners for the plus 20 DP race and the 3-minute marathon are basically the same list. Standard bearers pull away from the rest of the pack. The 5 and 6 stars are about 15% better than Myrtle, but they're all in the same league. Vulpesfolia is also fantastic on this timescale. Her S2 is a solid skill on its own, then her talent adds about a quarter of a Myrtle of DP on top. That brings her to 97% of Myrtle's DP gen, which is slightly above the DP of Standard Bearer's S2s, but with far more combat utility than either. Agents and Chargers look good on paper, but only if they live in some ridiculous fantasy world where they have infinite targets for 3 minutes straight. Let me know if you ever find that level. Vulpesfolia's S3 is also good here. It's at 0.9 Myrtles, which is below the S tier, but still a cut above most everybody else. Finally, let's discuss combat power. Myrtle is obviously a terrible lane holder. If we filter to just the more combat-forward Vanguards, the ceiling is lower, but there's still a lot of distance between the best and worst operators. For quick returns, Flametail and Texas are good. Mulcease is also the only Tactician who refunds her cost on her first skill cycle. Vulpesfolia we just discussed, and Matsukiri hits about 0.8 Myrtles before counting his discounts. Flametail and Texas clock in at 0.7 Myrtles over a longer time horizon, which is good among pioneers. That's the global summary, but now we'll zoom in on each subclass. Before we do, if this analysis is helpful for you, now is a good time to throw a like on this video to help expand its reach. First, let's cover Myrtle's subclass, Standard Bearers. The key trait on Standard Bearers is that they have block 1, which drops to block 0 during their skill. They produce a lot of DP with those skills, which are always auto-recovery with 8 to 15 second durations. This puts them squarely in the Type 1 category. Standard Bearers can't reliably hold a lane on their own, so their job is to produce enough DP that you can deploy someone who can hold a lane. They all have basically the same S1. It does nothing but generate DP. The 5 and 6 stars get an upgraded version of Myrtles. It cycles slightly slower, but generates more DP, so the higher rarity ops are worth about 1.2 Myrtles over the long term, with comparable short-term stats like break-even time. S1 is always the best choice for DP generation. However, S2 or S3 offer some additional utility like healing, buffs, or revealing invisibility. When you want to use those, the big question is, how much DP are you sacrificing for them? Salih's S3 is the least viable. Long term, it's 0.7 Myrtles of DP, which is Pioneer levels of DP without Pioneer levels of combat power. The S2s are all pretty good, though. They have long-term DP generation above 0.9 Myrtles, but the big difference is in time to first activation, especially for Salih. They're good in a longer level, but bad for a sprint. Next up, we'll talk Pioneers. With block 2, fast attacks, and decent stats, Pioneers are good early lane holders. Their DP generation is moderate, usually around 0.7 Myrtles, but it's consistent over time. This makes them Type 2 Vanguards. They can hold a lane long enough for you to deploy the rest of the support you need for the level. A bunch of Pioneers have the same S1, Charge Gamma. It clocks close to 0.7 Myrtles depending on operator cost, and matches Myrtle's break-even time and 30-second return time. On paper, that makes it one of the better Pioneer skills, but you shouldn't use it. All it does is generate DP. If all you need is DP, you probably want a Standard Bearer. If you need the combat power of a Pioneer, you probably also want to use a skill that boosts their combat power. For a quick early burst of DP, Pioneers have some good options. Texas is the overall queen of break-even time, A rank on 30-second return, and then 0.7 Myrtles long term, which is B rank overall, but good among Pioneers. Flametail and Chiave have very similar S2s. They all have access to the Y module that decreases their first deploy cost by 4, which helps get them on the field faster. Texas wins because of her talent and because Flametail costs slightly more. While Chiave is close on these metrics, his overall kit is far worse. Don't use him. For long-term DP generation, Vulpesfolia is peak among Pioneers. Her S2 is 0.75 Myrtles on its own, which is very good for a Pioneer. But on top of that, her talent provides plus 10% base DP generation rate, which is almost a quarter of a Myrtle on its own. But be aware that these numbers assume the default 1 DP per second base rate. In Annihilation missions, certain contingency contract penalties, or other selected levels, this bonus will be decreased or inactive. But if it's in full effect, Scary Fox is almost a Standard Bearer in long-term DP, but with far superior combat stats. The other Pioneer of note is Siege with her S2, but there's an asterisk here. The skill can't be triggered unless there's an enemy to attack, and these numbers assume a steady stream of enemies dying near her to help charge it via her talent. In this way, she functions a lot like a charger with block 2, and less like a typical pioneer. But when conditions are right, she is one of the better pioneers. But for comparison, I listed her stats without those bonuses, and they're much less interesting. Since pioneers are capable in combat, I also wanted to compare the DP output when using their best combat skills. Vulpes Folia we just discussed, and Texas is number 2. Saga is B rank across the board. Her S2 also scores solid Bs with some slightly different numbers than you see here. Flametail's S3 is B rank over the long term with a slow start. Everyone else is pretty bad for DP Gen and not very worth discussing. Next up are Tacticians. They are high ground operators with a low ground minion that doesn't consume deployment slots. The minion is usually block 1 and auto revives over time after being defeated. Their DP generation is pretty low, but they have reliable auto charging skills like most pioneers. Although they only have 1 block, they are close to pioneers in lane holding. Sniper-like range means they can get several attacks in on enemies before they even reach the minion, which increases the likelihood that block 1 is enough. Since the minion revives at 0 cost, you can use them strategically to bait big attacks and not sweat it too much if they die. All this means that Tacticians are mostly Type 2. Their DP gen isn't great, but they can hold down the fort, including flying enemies, while you build up DP for the rest of your team. They can also be Type 3, since strategic use of the minion can make them usable in spite of DP gen. DP gen is not really the strength of this subclass, but I'll still stack rank them. Vigil's S2 is an outlier for long-term DP generation at 0.72 myrtles. The chief drawback is that you have to build and use Vigil. Mulcis is up next, and her minions can be amazing. Her S2 and S3 have the exact same DP profile, but different combat benefits. She has the best break-even time because she's the only tactician who breaks even on her first skill cycle. Black Knight and Mulcis have pretty similar long-term DP gen, and Beanstalk brings up the rear. Black Knight and Beanstalk can both have reasons to use their S2s, but DP is not one of them. Next up, we have Agents. Agents are a tricky one. They often grant DP per attack or have an offensive recovery skill. Agents have a 2-tile reach and can hit aerial enemies, but are relatively fragile. This mostly puts them into Vanguard Type 1. They generate a good burst of DP, and you hope to get enough of it to deploy tanks in front of them before they need to take too many hits. That said, they also have some Type 2 traits. Their longer range and high attack stats means they can hold a lane decently with just block 1. Their variable DP gen makes it very hard to do an apples-to-apples comparison with other operators. Where pioneers and standard bearers are consistent, agents can swing from broken to dead weight, based on whether or not they have something to hit. And perfect target availability can be hard to achieve. It requires that an enemy stays in range, doesn't die, and also doesn't kill the agent. There's actually a good number of stages with tanky, stationary enemies at the start that you can leverage for 100% efficiency on at least the first skill cycle. You can also cheese this requirement by using Stainless and his S3 turret, but that's a 22 DP investment just to make your DP generators more effective. The situations where that's a meta-relevant strategy are rare. Under ideal conditions, every single agent has at least one skill that exceeds Myrtle's long-term DP average, meets or exceeds her 30-second output, and breaks even 5 seconds slower at worst. If you can hit these ideal conditions, agents are peak Vanguard. The real question is how close reality comes to these ideal conditions. The first thing we can wipe out is these long-term numbers. Ideal conditions do show up, but they don't show up for 3 minutes straight. Agents are really unlikely to actually compete with a standard bearer over a long deployment. Stationary bosses are the closest you will ever come. Within the constraints of reality, there are 2 good ways to use agents. The first is a Helidrop Blitz. You drop your agent where they have one beefy target they can hit or a series of smaller targets. You run their first skill cycle, which takes 10 to 20 seconds. You try to get them as close as possible to peak output for that cycle. Afterwards, you may just retreat them to recover a few more DP. There are 4 skills worth evaluating for this. Cantabile and Surfer have almost identical S1s that are built for exactly this. And Inez and Chilchuk's S2s are ready 5 seconds after deploy, so they can do this very well also. Surfer and Cantabile are absolutely exceptional here. Plus 18 DP in 30 seconds is 3x what you can get from Myrtle, and plus 10 over the closest competition who isn't on this table. Inez and Chilchuk are also quite good for this. A bonus for Inez is that her S2 expands her range, both longer and wider. This gives her a much wider set of circumstances where she has enough targets and range to max the return from her skill. Also note that agents have a faster redeploy time, so you can repeat this cycle. They cost more on second deployment, but also refund more on retreat. So the second and third cycle for Cantabile and Surfer return 16 and 14 DP respectively, which is still better than anyone else in the game. The second model is for a longer deployment. We use S2 for all of them in this model. I tried to model these with skill cycles at 80% of ideal plus longer time between cycles, since you would generally wait for the right cluster of enemies before triggering the skill. These numbers are somewhat made up, just to give you a sense of how these agents perform versus their peers. They're roughly in the ballpark of Pioneers, with great early break-even times. Once again, keep in mind that Inez's larger range means it's easier to get her to ideal performance than the others. Next up, we'll talk Strategists, or really Strategist, because there's only one until Silver Ash the Rainfrost is released. Stat-wise, he's a lot like Pioneers. Block 2, and a bit stronger stats, but with slower attacks. This makes him very much a Type 2 Vanguard, like Pioneers. The big question for analysis is how to treat his DP cost reduction. Skill 1 reduces the cost of your most expensive unit by 4. Should we count that as DP? If they're the next unit you want to deploy, then it accelerates your time to deployment, and the answer is definitely yes. But if you want to deploy somebody else, that's a bonus that won't kick in until later, if at all. If we only count true DP, he's still pretty decent. Comparing him to Pioneers, he's on the high side for DP gen. If we add in the cost reduction, he's great. S1 exceeds Myrtle, and S2 is pretty close to Vulpus Folia. Finally, let's talk about Chargers. I do not like Chargers. Chargers are even harder to compare to the rest of the field than agents. They score DP on kill, so like agents, they're dependent on target availability, but not just availability, but also target HP and defense. Virtually every Charger has access to the X module, which doubles the DP per kill from 1 to 2, which is a sure sign that the archetype is garbage without that. Nevertheless, I will try to give them a fair shake in this analysis and then explain why I don't like them. Their DP gain is fully dependent on their kill rate. Charger skills are almost inconsequential except for their ability to influence kill rate. There are two key variables here. First is how many hits it takes to kill an enemy, and second is how fast the enemies stream in. Even pretty ordinary enemies take 2 to 4 hits to kill without a skill active, and on most maps, enemies in a lane are spaced at something like 3 to 7 seconds apart during active waves, and even slower averaged across the whole level. So we see a range from very competitive scores at the high end of this chart versus very low scores at the low end. So why do I think Chargers are bad as opposed to just situational? There are 3 problems. First, they don't scale well with difficulty. Achieving the high kill speed that makes them shine doesn't just require enemies that spawn close together, it requires weak enemies that can be killed in just a few hits. But difficult content tends not to involve large swarms of weak enemies. It involves tough enemies that take some work to kill. When enemies get tough, Chargers get worse rapidly. Easy levels are not the sort of level where you need to ask which Vanguard will bring the max DP per second. Second, they require a constant stream of enemies to shine. But with range 1 and block 1, a constant stream of enemies is exactly the scenario where they're the most likely to leak an enemy. Their greatest strength is also their greatest weakness. A slug charge is their ideal setup for max DP, but it's also too much for them. Here's Bagpipe, generating a good amount of DP from a slug charge, but other Vanguards actually dealing with the slug charge. Third, they don't share well. They don't just need to contribute, they need to get the kill. You need to place them in the busiest lane to be effective, but if you start adding other operators to strengthen that lane, they just get worse and worse. Chargers are just bad. If you need DP, bring a better Vanguard. If you need DPS, wait 6 more seconds and deploy a guard instead. I love our friendly Potato Princess, but honestly the most meta way to use her is just to add her to the squad and leave her on the bench so your other Vanguards get passively better. Most of the time, a Charger on your squad is a wasted slot. That's all for today. Please subscribe if you enjoy my content and let me know in the comments if you have any Arknights questions you need answered with an overabundance of math. Till next time.